Hi, welcome to the channel where we provide an alternative view to the common narrative. Today is Sunday, the 30th of April, and I would like to talk about Ukraine, the common counteroffensive, and everything that goes with it. So if you are interested, please continue watching. Hi, welcome back to the channel. Well, like I said in my introduction, I'm going to talk mostly about the events in Ukraine, especially maybe talking about the counteroffensive, the so-called counteroffensive, and the events that might lead to it and upwards of it. Well, we have been hearing now for how long about the proposed counteroffensive that the Ukrainians are planning to do. But I'm not totally sure whether it is going to happen or not, and what form it might take on. There's a general narrative that the armament and ammunition of the Ukrainian army has been largely destroyed, and that they are lacking the necessary equipment to start off a counteroffensive. Then we hear that the Americans have delivered, and Europeans have delivered a number of tanks. But then we have the leak of Tech Zero, which basically explains on how the Ukrainian troops must still be trained and formed, and how many weapons and armored vehicles and tanks they require, and by what time, and have they been delivered, and have they not been delivered. Then I read an article that Italy has provided something like 20 self-propelled artillery pieces, but none of them were functioning when they delivered. So they still had to be repaired and refurbished. Then I read an article that most of the German panzers do not have the same ammunition. I don't know why. I don't know why they have different cannon pieces on it. I don't know why they have different ammunition requirements. That's not explained, but the Ukrainians cannot use the same artillery rounds or tank rounds on all the tanks. So there's a huge logistical problem for an headache for the Ukrainians. Then a number of these panzers don't work or have broken down as soon as they arrived. So some of them are now in storage, and they are basically cannibalized to repair the other systems. Then we hear the Ukrainians have suffered significant losses in material and manpower in Bakhmut, which is the purpose or the aim of the Russians. Then I hear that they're not ready, the Ukrainians are not ready yet for the counteroffensive because they don't have enough all the weapons and so on. Then there are excuses made for one shouldn't expect too much on this counteroffensive, so downplaying the success rate already. Then they see, then you hear the narrative, but Ukraine must be very successful in the counteroffensive, otherwise they're going to run out of money or support from the West. And so if you listen to it, it's a huge contradictions, huge problems for the Ukrainian army. And on the other side, you hear nothing from the Russians. What the Russians are basically doing is they are just bombarding the Ukrainian troops. Any concentration of troops that are being formed are bombarded by glide bombs. I think a couple of days back, I think maybe on Saturday or Friday, there was a huge cruise missile attack on the command center. It seems to me they found, well, I could count about 6 smoke trails from these cruise missiles fired from the Navy, Russian Navy. And the way that I understand it, it was all concentrated on a single target, and that was a command center. And according to the Russians, it was successfully destroyed. And firing 6 caliber type of missiles on one location means that that was a very high value target. Then we also hear that the Russians fired some Iskander missiles onto a concentration of the Georgian detachment, which are not only mercenaries from Georgia, but also from other foreign countries. And since the Georgian detachment is very cruel and driven by ideals, very idealistic and so on, and they are responsible for a number of Russian POWs that were killed and tortured, and atrocities filed against civilians. For the Russians to fire an expensive weapon such as an Iskander on a position like that also counts that it is a high-value target and that they are serious about this type of targeted killing, if you want to call it. As far as I understand, more than 80 soldiers have died in that attack. Call it fanatics, terrorists, mercenaries. Well, they can be sort of nearly classified as being similar to ISIS, but that's not my point of view. Well, that's not my point that I'm trying to make. And then we have the Battle of Bakhmut still going on. You know, I said in my previous video, Bakhmut. Every time there is, Bakhmut is going to fall now, Bakhmut is going to fall now. But it doesn't seem as if the Russians are really intent of capturing Bakhmut, as long as they can kill enough Ukrainian and suck up enough Ukrainian resources. But at the end of the day, it's still a battle, it's not the war. So the question really has to ask, what can we expect and what is this all about? And my, I wouldn't say conclusion, but my narrative on this matter is that the West haven't played back yet. The Ukrainians haven't received all the armaments. They don't have the troop amassed. They are not very confident, except for their propaganda and Zelensky that talks about the effectiveness of this counter, or the success of this counter-offensive, and the recapture of Crimea and the Donbas region, Kherson region. I'm sorry to say, I don't think much will happen here. This is not going to happen now, in very shortly, maybe in the next couple of weeks. Things that are not working out for Ukrainians as they should. But I listened to analysis by Scott Ritter. He talked about that the Russians have about 500,000 troops. The Ukrainians have a similar 500,000-600,000 troops amassed. But the problem is that this is not an ordinary war. This is not a Second World War. I've read some articles and watched some videos about the Russian soldiers as they talked about strategy and so on. And the problem is that they cannot assemble a lot of people into certain locations, because then they become targets of artillery and HIMARS and, well, the Ukrainians don't have an air force, but the Russians do have. So, you see, the maximum group you can assemble in any location is about a platoon, which is about 30 persons. And then they have to sleep in all different places, because in order to minimize casualties during a bombardment artillery attack. So the first question that has to arise, and it has already been proven wrong, not wrong, is concentrations of Ukrainian troops in order to start the offensive. That is going to be very, very difficult. Because as soon as you assemble a company of 1,000 men, 100 men, or a battalion, I'm talking about my definitions. I don't always understand all the Ukrainian army designations and so on. Or 1,000 men, or 4,000 men, then how are you going to assemble them? Because as soon as you have a high concentration of personnel and vehicles and so on, the Russians will detect it, they will know about it, and they will start a bombing run, whether with glided bombs, whether with cruise missiles, whether with normal artillery, depending on the distance from it. So the problem already arises on how you're going to concentrate, say, 200,000 troops that you want to employ, Ukraine wants to employ in a counteroffensive. They talk about 260 tanks. So what are they going to do with these 260 tanks? They're going to storm over the open plains and approach the Russian front lines? They're not going to last long because there are multiple counter measurements. All that the Russians have to do is they have, call it, carrier artillery rounds. That means they can carry certain bomblets. Both of them are, they can saturate the attacking field with anti-tank mines that are being delivered by these 152 artillery rounds. They can have a lot of suicide drones in the air flying at certain stages. They have proper anti-tank weapons. And by the way, so I read an article as well that the Russians have assembled tank killer teams. And the main focus of these tank killer teams are to search out the Western supplied tanks and annihilate them and destroy them. So now they have specialized soldiers that are dedicated for tank destructions. And then, you know, a tank is a tank. It maybe protects the crew inside the tank, but the tracks can still be disabled. The tank can still be brought to standstill. Armored vehicles and so on are not sufficient protection against 152 artillery rounds. Even armor piercing, any UIV type of system. So, in my opinion, any type of mass frontal attack will be result in an annihilation of the Ukrainian army. Why? Because the Russians have the manpower and the equipment in mass, enough of them. So I'm not totally sure how they plan on doing it. Assembling these men is difficult, and then you have to, before the attack, you have to bring all these splinter groups into one single mass front line, and then storm whatever you want to do on a Russian front line. And then you have to ask yourself, but how logistically wise, command and control wise, how difficult is that going to be able to achieve? Because the Russians will know where their concentrations are. They have enough intelligence in terms of satellite imagery, UIVs, ground intelligence, electronics, where they can pick up the radio chatter, even if they don't understand it, even if it's encrypted. They can pinpoint the location of these things. And the most important is the Russian Air Force is becoming much more involved in the fighting and bombardment of Ukrainian troops. And there's another point, like it is being said in the Texera, those release papers, that the Ukrainians are going to run out of air defense missiles by the end of May. What the Russians have done is, and this is what I don't think most people understand. There was a saying that goes around that says the generals always prepare a new war based on the previous war. And maybe the Russians did that the same. And there were mistakes made at the beginning of the SMO. Yes, the Russians made mistakes. But they did learn and they did recover. And I spoke many times about this, that Putin has given basically the military carte blanche in terms of new military systems requirements. He stated that the manufacturers should send their design engineers to the front in order to improve their weapons. And yes, the one thing that we always talk about is that the Russians have a form of attritional war, bombardment, wants to kill as many not as many Ukrainians, but at least weaken the Ukrainian military. But very, very important is they are also learning and adapting to the situation and improving their weapon systems. We have heard before that the anti-aircraft systems have been retuned in order to shoot down HIMARS missiles effectively. So that was already one of the improvements. The next improvements will all be the UIVs and so on. And artillery duels, they will learn how to do that. Well, they're already doing it now. And they're getting better. And the weapon system is getting better. And then for the Ukrainians to believe, for Zelensky to believe that they can retake Crimea is, I don't know. I know it's a fantasy, but they have a much better word description for that. So, unfortunately, the Ukrainians are planning their counteroffensive. They already see all the problems. They also know that they're not going to achieve much. But they have to keep the rhetoric and the propaganda going. So I don't expect much of this counteroffensive. If it happens and when it happens, on what size, I don't know. The big question is, what will happen afterwards? Well, in my opinion is that if they are counteroffensive and if they are doing it on a scale as they propose, then the Ukrainian army will be severely weakened. They will lose a lot of their equipment. And that will allow the Russians to move forward and basically start with their own offensive. And as I've stated many before, if there's no peace agreement at this stage, then they will probably move up the Dnieper River, take Odessa, and park in front of Kiev. And then there will be a new pause for probable negotiations, which will fail in any case. And then the Russians might decide to even advance further. Because the point here is not whether they want or they don't want. They don't really want to do it. But they will be forced to do it. Because the three aims of the reason for the SMO cannot be realized unless there is a proper peace agreement, and which I doubt will happen. Now, on the other side of the narrative, we hear that the Americans are threatening, the Ukrainians have to perform in this counteroffensive. And but money is starting to get going to be curbed back. Support is going to be curbed back. So if the Ukrainians don't achieve much, then they're going to force Ukraine to start negotiations. Now, I disagree with that totally. Because again, the West has a certain objective. And the objective is to destroy Russia. And the only way, or keep them busy, sort of bleed them dry. That means a stalemate. That means a minimized conflict. And basically, if the Russians then move up to just outside Kiev, and then sort of get a lull in the fighting, because that will be winter again, then the Ukrainians can re-equip, consolidate their positions in the army, military, and so on. And then there will be another confrontation next year. And that is what the US wants. Will the US stop funding Ukraine? No. You see, the problem is not Ukraine. It's again the focus on Russia. And what the America will do is, I talked about this, they have spent like 150 billion probably at this stage to Ukraine. But of this 150 billion, only 50 billion went to physically armament to Ukraine. And most of that 50 billion is old junk in any case. And then one has to ask the question, what happens to the other 100%, 100 billion? And that is, the big question. But it's not that big a question, actually. All that money went back to you will find it in the literature, that it is to instruct the military-industrial complex to build new weapons in order to replace these old, obsolete weapons with basically new, modern weapons. So that will fund to the military-industrial complex. But again, that's not the whole story. The story is that the Western weapon stockpiles are running out. The narrative is that the military-industrial complex of the Western world and America is not capable of producing the weapon systems that are required in the modern war as they now experience in Ukraine. So my argument is even if there's a new president coming into being appointed in America, and we all know it doesn't matter which president and who it is. At the end of the day, the deep state controls the American foreign policy. That money will now be spent in order to modernize and upgrade the military-industrial complex, not only in America, but as well in Europe, in order to expand their production facilities and get them and develop them to produce more armament. And we're not talking here about a 3 months objective. We are talking about a 2-year, 3-year type of scenario. And why would they do it? Well, firstly, like I said, they don't have the necessary military-industrial capability, production capability. They cannot produce enough ammunition, missiles, or whatever is required. So they are expanding their production. Not enough tanks to produce that. Air defense systems. All the things that they're noticing they are lacking. They are also learning, just as much as the Russians are learning. So they are in the preparation phase for a much bigger conflict. And what is the much bigger conflict? Well, one can see that we are definitely, actively, at a huge pace, starting to create a multipolarity world. America and the West is going to lose if there's a multipolarity. They will lose their strength, their influence, their power. That is sort of a given. So this is the final attempt by the Western world and America to prevent the multipolar world. And the two instigators or the two driving forces into the multipolarity is number one, China, and number two is Russia. China is the biggest influence because it's the biggest industrial economy. And therefore it has the biggest influence. That's why you see a lot of transactions being done in yuan as well, mostly in yuan. But we know that yuan is not going to replace the dollar because at the end of the day, what Janet Yellen doesn't understand is that the multipolarity world doesn't create an alternative currency to the US dollar. That's not the objective. There will be no national currency that replaces the dollar. there will be another mechanism that is not dependent on any country and won't be able to be influenced by any government in a said specific country. And therefore, the US dollar will deteriorate. It will lose power. It will not disappear. It will lose its purchasing power and its influence and its status as the reserve currency. And that can happen, although Janet Allen doesn't believe that. But I'm digressing again. So, in order to stop the multipolarity world, the West, and I'm talking about mostly US, has to confront China. And the 2 points of contention there is Taiwan and South Korea. So there would be a much bigger chance of a conflict or confrontation between China and the US than the US and Russia. What the US rather would like to see is that Europe takes over and continues the battle with Ukraine. But then there's also an old Europe and a new Europe, and I will talk about that, make another video, which totally differs. The old Europe is the Western country before, during the Cold War, and the new Europe is basically all the Soviet Union type of countries that have joined the EU. And the old ones, I'm not sure they convince their population to fight. But the new ones are still willing to do it, and that is where the role of Poland comes into. And I will talk about that in another video. So basically, if I have to sum it up, is that Ukraine will start the special military operation, counter-offensive. Sorry, not special. Will start the counter-offensive. They will be experience severe losses in terms of manpower and equipment. They will be considerably weakened, and that will be the stage after that where the Russians will progress up to probably the Dnieper River, taking Odessa and all the other stuff that goes with it. Then there will be a new winter, matters will settle down, and then maybe Russia will realize that they have to get rid of Zelensky and his right-wing, right-sector type of crowd that sort of rules together with him in the same office. And then they might be forced for a peace settlement, but that's only going to happen next year. In the meantime, the Americans and the West will develop and improve or expand their military-industrial complex to produce the necessary ammunition and missiles and tanks and air defense systems and so on, so they can keep up with the Russians. The sanctions wars will go on, and until the Americans are then ready to commit to a certain conflict with probably China. But neither the China are ready now, neither are the Americans. And that is clearly proven by the current influence in Ukraine. One can also look at the type of weapons that NATO has developed and focused on in the last 30, 40 years. And they also realize that that is not sufficient in order to fight a huge power like China or Russia. So they have still a lot of development that they have to do. So this is basically how I see it. We're not going to have peace in the near future. And even if Ukraine falls, there is a backup, and the backup is Poland. Maybe there won't be a conflict between Poland and Russia, but there will be a standoff between them. So hopefully I explained my view properly and you do understand it. And that's my story for today then. So until next time, cheers.